You're listening to Chicago Stories, a podcast from City Hall featuring the stories of everyday Chicagoans and special guests, as told to Mayor Emanuel.
This is Mayor Emanuel with Chicago Stories. We're with Derek Black, also known as Roland Derek, and we will get through why that, who's the subject of this book, Rising Out of Hatred, The Awakening of a Former White Nationalist. All right, I'm fascinated here. I'm not sure where to begin, but I just want to. So, what was the journey? As you said, you're openly a white nationalist. Now, you're in the belly of the beast of the University of Chicago.
That's true.
But more importantly, to your awakening that you're not a white nationalist, but actually you want to talk about how you've come to understand diversity as a strength rather than looking at it as the way that a white nationalist would talk about what's happening to America.
Yeah.
That's like 7 questions. Pick any one of the 7 you want to answer.
Sure. I mean, I think the key parts of all of that is, one, it took a long time. It wasn't some immediate change, but I grew up in the leadership of the white nationalist movement. My dad started the first white nationalist website, and it became the largest white nationalist community. And his best friend since the time he was a teenager was David Duke. And so I grew up with those campaigns happening, and my house would be sort of a nexus for trying to run those things. And my dad did all the digital stuff back when innovative to do digital stuff on a campaign. And so I knew all those people, and I got really invested in it, and I believed it, and I ran online radio and did all of that up until I was 19 years old and went to college. And college is this 2 or 3 year period of questioning that stuff.
If I'm understanding, as you say in the book, if you want to say no to something, you have to have something to say yes to.
Yeah.
So what was your yes, and how's the first kind of crack in this kind of philosophical outlook? What was the beginning process of that crack that opened you up to a different perspective?
Yeah. I mean, I always give the answer that people will hear the story and they hear about the part that my friend there invited me to the Shabbat dinners, and that was really stupendously key that he invited me, and I met.
This is Matthew?
Yeah, Matthew Stevenson, and then his...
I just want you to know,
right,
as I said when I first expressed.
Not a very Jewish last name, I heard.
Well, Matthew's not exactly Old Testament either.
Yeah.
So I was like, I want to check out Matthew's synagogue membership.
I mean, it's in the book.
I got it. You don't have to verify for me. I just want to meet Matthew's parents in the naming process. Not that everybody has to be Ram, but Matthew ain't close. Ram's a lot closer than Matthew.
I think the important thing is he was the only Orthodox practicing Jewish kid on campus at the time, right? He held regular Shabbat dinners, and it's probably important for people to realize that white nationalism is deeply anti-Semitic in case there's some questioning about that in some ways they're more focused on anti-Semitism than they are on race. It's founded in this deep, complicated conspiracy theory of Jewish influence and control, which
Zionist,
you're probably familiar with.
Yeah, the Zionist protocol, the bankers, journalists.
And that's the background. That's what David Duke and my dad and my whole family and everybody really espouse.
The whole white nationalist is more about, on the Christian side, of the Jewish hatred than it is, not that racial is soft, but the underpinning is anti-Semitism.
And when they get together and they talk about what they're opposed to, they don't talk about they're opposed to, black cultural organizations. They talk that they're opposed to Jewish cultural organizations. That's the Anti-Defamation League is their big enemy. That's how they talk about stuff. So that's quite important that Matthew was inviting me to these dinners, and that's the worldview I was coming out of. And he knew what that background. He knew my background.
But Derek, given your background, what made you say yes to the thing that you were supposed to hate?
Yeah, I was always raised with the idea that you should never preclude who you can talk to. That you should never preclude who you can be friends with to an extent on, their religion or their race or anything. That it may be true, and white nationalists very firmly believe that race predicts everything about your life. But on an individual basis, it's kind of ignorant to not talk to somebody. And so that was the opening. It was just that, sure, Matthew and I knew each other. We could talk. I thought.
Did you guys take classes together?
Yeah, I was on campus for a semester before he found out my background, so we had traded study guides, and he liked country music, and I could play music on my guitar, and we'd sing because he was in the dorm next to me, so we had each other's phone numbers. And so getting invited was not it was kind of mundane, you know. It was like I wasn't getting too many other invitations because the campus was pretty firm once my background was found out. This 800-person liberal arts college that we hate white nationalism and we're going to ostracize the kid. And like because they're a small enough campus, they were pretty well able to assert those values. So getting invited to his dinner was, you know, something to do on a Friday night, if nothing else.
Yeah. And that process, that dinner is the beginning process.
Yeah.
That walks you the journey of
it was
walking away from one outlook or philosophy or approach.
And it took a couple of years, and it was traumatic, and it's not something where you just go, oh, I was wrong, you know, and move on. It's something that a lot of these conversations with another person who was dorm mates with Matthew named Allison Gornick, who talked to me about this stuff and, you know, challenged it and was really repulsed by white nationalism, but she wasn't a person of color. She wasn't Jewish. She wasn't personally threatened by it in that way. And so like a lot of this stuff was her saying, first of all, why do you believe this? And me explaining what the evidence is and I think it's scientific, and her saying that there's no science behind this. We need to actually teach you how statistics works, you know, and then beyond that, like you're actually hurting people like Matthew that you care about and other people who come to these dinners that you're friends with. How in the world can you possibly say that this doesn't hurt people? You are advocating discrimination, you know, and I wanted to be somebody who wasn't hurting other people. And, you know, once I accepted that I was, that was kind of the road to the end.
How did the other members of the Shabbat dinner open to you?
I think they all took it in different ways, right? Some of them that would talk about it. They would talk about their own identities. They would talk about, you know, how I'm relating to this. But I think most of them took the approach of hanging out with them in itself is going to have some impact because...
Well, they were right.
Right, yeah. I think Matthew and Juan, who was another guy I hung out with a lot at his family immigrated from Peru. They looked at it as... I seemed kind of nice, and it cannot be the case that I actually am going to hang out with them like that and still advocate that they don't belong, you know? Like in the long run it was true, but it wasn't that alone, you know? Ostracism played a huge role. Like it made me want to listen, but that didn't do it alone. Hanging out with people and realizing that they're not just ideas of people was important, but it didn't do it alone. You know, dismissing all the scientific evidence was super important, but it didn't do it alone. So I think like the answer is a lot of stuff.
Listening to you makes me think that if you really want to try to get past, quote unquote, the divisions in America, exposure outside of your comfort zone is like the biggest thing. Yeah. To find A, what you agree with, and B, maybe you should rethink what you're thinking.
I think going to that question you asked earlier about what did I say yes to, I didn't realize it at the time, but what it was accepting a different community. That I thought that the most important community to me was, on one hand, like white nationalists, but then their idea of white people being victimized and all the stuff that goes along with that. And the New College thing, looking back on it, was a different kind of community and all of, you know, the responsibilities that go along with that and who you care about and who's important to you, and the number of people that matter kind of grows. You can't dismiss other people if you consider them a part of your community.
How did your father and siblings take it if you kind of said what you're teaching, that's not the stuff I buy into anymore?
Yeah, not well. And I didn't present it to them in the best way that I could. Like I didn't talk to them about it during those 2 years where I was having these conversations. I just stopped doing the radio and stopped posting on my dad's website and stopped engaging. But I didn't say I'm fundamentally questioning whether what we're doing is right here until I wrote this public letter denouncing it. And so that was just devastating.
Oh, so that's how you communicated it?
Yeah. It was not great. It could have been better if I had said, you know, I have a serious thing to talk about. Instead, I, you know, wrote this public letter, and it was a lot of devastating conversations. And I think it's really to their credit that over the years they've
come around.
Yeah, no, they haven't come around, but they're like, we should be able to talk. You know, we should be able to talk on the phone. That this is, even though they're still committed white nationalists, they still run Stormfront, they still do all this stuff. I still have like family members who are marching at Charlottesville. But being able to text with my parents is something that feels like it's impressive.
How do you define white nationalists? I mean, I know, because I'm sitting here, I'm realizing we're talking about white nationalism and the philosophy, and my guess is that's at 10,000 feet. So if I ask you as kind of like the standard definition of what white nationalism is,
Sure.
How would you define it as somebody who's now can look back,
Yeah.
both outside in and inside out?
Small, pretty cohesive group.
Uh-huh.
They tend to know each other, or at least of each other. You're talking about a few thousand people who actively are a part of this, and they believe that race is biological. They believe that race is this real thing that predicts people's behavior, and consequently, they think that all people should live only among people of their, quote unquote race. And then on top of that, they believe the only reason that everybody wants that, that white people are inherently racist and want segregation, and the only reason that that doesn't happen is because of a global Jewish conspiracy. And I think the latter thing is how you can start identifying a white nationalist as opposed to more run-of-the-mill kind of like
Racist?
a racist person or a racist idea, because the white nationalist starts talking about crazy conspiracies. And for the record, that was one of the things that fell apart for me earliest, was just that the Jewish conspiracy stuff was crazy, Like, I believe for a long time.
Well, trust me, I know.
Right, I believe for a long time in the like race malarkey, the idea that like race is something real and it really says something about people. Like, that was harder to disentangle. But the idea that a Jewish conspiracy just doesn't work. Like, they believe that the Holocaust didn't happen, and if you want to be a historian, it's just there's there's no evidence to support that. So how are you going to maintain it? Whereas race is this thing that I think to most Americans, like, they don't quite understand what you mean when you say race is not real or it's a social construct. They say, like, it's an identity and people believe it, So that idea, I think, takes a lot more nuance, understanding what it means that race is cultural when people look around and they feel like it's real,
I think it's your dad that said the target audience isn't fellow white nationalists. The target audience is folks that say, I'm not a racist, but, comma. What does he mean by that? Yeah. Why is that the target audience?
I mean, it's because they worked on this for decades. My dad and David Duke met when they were 16 and 17 years old, and so spent decades working on this. And they're always real clear that they didn't want a marginal group of crazy people. They believed that there was this large bulk of people,
more mainstream?
Yeah, mainstream people who held a lot of racist ideas, but who didn't want to be called racist. And that's not even necessarily a political thing. It wasn't that they were only looking for conservatives or something. Like, they viewed progressives, white progressives, as potential people to convince that affirmative action was unfair to their kids, or that welfare was taking money from them. Like, that kind of stuff that is not, maybe it's kind of benign. Maybe it sounds like the kind of thing you can debate, but taken together, it becomes pretty radical. And so, like, David in the 80s and 90s wanted to demonstrate that you could win elections with essentially white nationalism without calling yourself a racist, and he was successful at that to some extent.
Are you surprised, looking at what's happening today, that how mainstream white nationalism has become?
I mean, I wish it weren't.
If you thought otherwise, you wouldn't be on this podcast. So let me just break the news. But are you surprised that we have a president that uses similar rhetoric? Are you surprised at how? I mean, you said David Duke wanted to show that you could have this philosophy and run in the democratic process and succeed. Is there any surprise? Let me say, forget not personalize it to you.
Yeah. Just from growing in
the white nationalists, are they surprised that this is farther along than they? That's a congressional district, a state representative district.
Yeah, that was a small.
We're talking about national politics now. More tilted in a way that we've never seen.
And it's important to remember, like, David won that state legislature race in '89, but then he couldn't get Senate, he couldn't get governor. He got a majority of the white vote in Louisiana, but he couldn't make it. And so there's a lot of signs that it wasn't going to work, but maybe out of desperation. My family always believed eventually it'll go, and they would look to people like Pat Buchanan, maybe to sanitize it and bring it to a broader audience. But then he didn't do well in the 2000 presidential race. He didn't win the Republican nomination. So there was a lot of evidence that it wasn't going to work, but they always kept the flame. And I came up in that. I was born in '89, and in 2008 when Barack Obama, won, I remember we had this big rally. It was one of the biggest ones that had happened in my lifetime, and I spoke at it, but other people spoke too, and the whole message was, oh man, there's going to be this major backlash. It's going to be a wave of racism, and candidates can be more explicit than they have in the past.
Because the President Obama's presence was more of a threat, and it was not subtle, it was upfront.
Exactly. That people who really did not like the idea of a black president would feel more comfortable voting for more explicit white nationalist ideas and being a little bit more comfortable with being called racist and not caring. Like that was the theory. And I don't know if they really thought it was going to be quite as successful as it turned out to be, but like they were pretty clear about the broad strokes, and that turned out, I think, to play out sort of how like David and other people were saying.
Well, Derek, do you think President Obama or President Trump is more? Who plays a bigger role then in the interpretation by white nationalists of their political mainstream success, if you can say that? Which I'm comfortable that it's up front and honest.
Yeah.
Because I don't think we should deal with subtleties, because I think the only way to defeat it is to actually confront it in the public and have it up front.
I mean, that might be the bright side of the current political situation, as we can talk about white supremacy being a thing that still exists in 2018 in ways that I think in 2015 people didn't believe. You know? So, I mean, I definitely don't want anybody to take this as the Obama candidacy is like did anything wrong. This is America, and we have a lot of unquestioned racist ideas that we need to deal with, right? And I think that Stormfront getting the biggest audience it ever had on the election night of Obama is just a sign of what was going to happen later on with the presidential campaign. And, you know, to be clear, like obviously Trump didn't win in an obvious way, and he didn't.
Right.
When we thought he wasn't going to win, it was because it was unlikely he was going to win. It's not like he represents America in a really broad way. It's just that these white nationalist ideas built up over time, and they tap a powerful thing about America. And I want to sort of repeat the idea earlier that white nationalists are not, they don't look at politics in the right-left way. They don't view it as conservatism and progressivism per se.
There's a different matrix.
Yeah, they're sort of so far to the right that they feel like they're off the scale. And they look at...
Let me break the news. They are. Okay.
But the way they think about things, though, allows them to sort of leverage that, right? And I don't think they're 100% wrong when they say that a progressive community that is majority white has some racist leanings, that has some tendencies towards the sort of segregationist ideas they're talking about.
Well, I just wrote a piece for The Atlantic that, well, you have Denny Hastert, Newt Gingrich's district, solidly Republican districts, both elected an African-American woman.
Right.
You got upstate New York, elected an African-American lawyer. You have Harris County, which is Houston, electing a Hispanic immigrant. And so the question, do you think President Trump's election was the apex and it's downhill? Since you basically on President Obama's election said it's the 8 years from now, not that you said 8 years, but this is our moment because now it's all exposed. Do you think this is the apex or just a milestone on a bigger, wider audience?
I don't know. I don't like to predict stuff.
Don't worry, this is not going to come into your tenure question as a professor, so don't worry about it.
When I'm applying for professorships, they're going to say your prediction didn't work out. I think...
Be a political consultant, you can make a lot of predictions. Nobody cares if you're right or wrong.
But if you're right, it's great.
Yeah, if you're right, trust me.
I'm going to go out 11. I think Trump will win again. You know,
but do you think it's on the apex of the? We'll argue that later.
My long-term fear, if we're talking about like what because I have this weird platform where people will allow me to talk about just the way that racist politics works in ways that some people don't get to because I came out of white nationalism and now I condemn it. And so I get in these chairs where people will say stuff. And so like my worry is that we don't recognize the way that privilege works, that there's wealth and power that is literally in the hands of white people who are an identifiable group, and there's an obligation there to try to make sure that things are more fair, that this does not continue generation to generation, that it is not a disadvantage to be a black person or a Hispanic person or person of color in general. And if we do not do that, then there's this future where you go 20, 30 years from now where America has become more unequal on race. But we have to actually do something about it. It's not that the moral arc changes. It's that we have to invest in anti-discrimination. We have to, whether that's affirmative action or whether that is social programs or whether it's education, it's something that the people in America, including white people who don't consider themselves racist, have to actively invest in. And if we don't do that, then white nationalism is sort of the status quo. And I know that sounds a little bit extreme, but because we have an enormous wealth gap in America, we have an enormous disadvantage towards people of color in America, and you have to actively right that. And that has to be a political agenda on the right and the left. Anti-racism needs to be something that is not the Democratic platform. It needs to be something that Americans invest in. So that's my prediction, is that if we do not actively do something about it, that the status quo becomes white nationalism.
You could have picked any profession. You had to go to you would go to academia. It's like you're truly in the belly of the beast here. This is like, if you're going to convert and leave aside the racism and or white nationalism philosophy.
Yeah.
You could have done anything. You pick academia. Don't you think that's like a lot of torture there, brother?
I don't know. I like it.
No, I'm not saying you wouldn't like it. I'm saying that's like in the belly of the beast.
Yeah, it's rough.
Your colleagues accepting of you, rather?
That's an interesting question, right? I spent 3 years after I renounced it, and that's when I adopted my middle name. I started going by Roland. I enrolled in a grad program. Right. I didn't speak about it at all to anyone, and I thought I never would need to. And that was 3 years living like that. And I didn't think I would, I had a roommate for those 3 years who I didn't tell about my background. He didn't know my family I had grown up in, and I didn't talk about it. And he found out because I started speaking again, and there was an article about it, and I sent it to him, so I guess that's a similar pattern to not telling my parents about these things. But academia was a nice place to live for a while, and then when that article came out, I really expected there to be a lot more of a backlash than there was. I expected the reaction to be, that's really gross. Glad I know, and I'm glad you've renounced it and you're doing something against it now. However, don't come to dinner, right, or something. And there's skepticism, sure, and we have a ton of really tough conversations with people, but in general, it's, I don't know, I think a lot more benefit of the doubt and acceptance that, okay, well, if you're going to do anti-racist stuff, then come to this meeting and I'll tell you what you can do, right?
I forgot to ask, when we were talking about Matthew and Allison, do you stay in touch with them?
Oh, yeah, I'm still partners with Allison, so that's the long-term outcome of that. And then Matthew and we hang out. He now lives in New York, and so I always stay on his couch when I'm...
That must be the life more of academia than friendship. I'm joking.
A little bit, yeah. He's also in it, though. He's over at Columbia doing business school, so he'll make more money.
He's at Columbia.
Yeah, he'll do more money than I will, but
it's okay with that. So you stayed in touch with Matthew and Allison.
Yep.
You're a professor.
No, a grad student.
Grad student?
Yeah.
What's your thesis on?
It's history. I've always done medieval history, but I guess I realized over the last couple of years that I started medieval history because I wanted to have something that felt like it didn't have anything to do with the present. And there's a lot you can say about the Middle Ages leading to nationalism and that, but I wanted something that's a little bit more concretely now. And so I'm trying to transition, do a dissertation on the very early stages of American colonialism and how medieval ideas about ethnicity and religion and race get invented at that time. Because there's the whole history of the Middle Ages that ends up getting transported to North America. And so when we're inventing the color line, or when they're inventing the color line and deciding about how important race is going to be, all this stuff, that's what we mean when we say race is a cultural invention. It took 300 or 400 years to invent that. And I'm trying to bring the fact that I can read Latin and I know the history of the European church to talk about that in ways that early Americanists.
Are you surprised what you're seeing in Europe today? Or that's
nationalism in Europe? Yeah. I mean, not surprised in the sense that white nationalism is very internationally connected. So Stormfront always had a major German subforum, a major French subforum, major British subforum. I grew up talking to people all over the world. When I would visit Europe, I could go stay on the couches of people who were running far-right political parties. All that existed in the early 2000s. And, I had friends who got to be European parliamentarians in Britain on a white nationalist platform. So this stuff always sort of existed. I guess I'm just sort of surprised it's quite as successful as it is now, much more so than it was a few years ago.
Chicago in white nationalist rhetoric is used as a metaphor for what? What does it symbolize? When it's a shorthand for what?
I mean, it's a shorthand for proof that people like to segregate themselves. Like outside of Chicago, white nationalists will talk about Chicago as this extremely segregated place and proof that white people want to segregate themselves to majority white neighborhoods, and that black people also want to do that. And then consequently, they say that this proves that gun crime and violence is something pertaining to black people. Like they'll use Chicago in that way, and you hear echoes of that in the way that the president talks about sending troops here.
I was going to ask you about that. Is it then perceived that Trump is talking to and speaking?
Oh, absolutely. I ran this little Republican committee campaign when I was 19 in South Florida, and I went door to door to like the 1,000 households nearest my house, and I won the campaign with like 60-something% of the vote. But I didn't tell anybody I was a white nationalist, and it was in 2008. But one of the main things I would talk about is Chicago, and it was in South Florida. It was in Palm Beach County, Florida, and I would go door to door. Yeah, in 08. It was like 2 months before the presidential campaign that year, and I was walking around. And I would say Chicago more than I would say South Florida. I would say, like, you don't want us to be like Chicago with all the crime and the violence, right? And it's this idea of Chicago and the people who live there that just terrified them. They didn't want black people in their neighborhood. They didn't want immigration. They wanted more policing. They had this idea of a world that they wanted to live in, and they thought Chicago was this example of what they were trying to avoid. And like thinking about Chicago as this idea for so long, and then moving to Hyde Park and living in the south side of Chicago for the last almost 3 years is...
I got two strains here. One is a white nationalist who then has moved to Chicago, a person who has gone into the academia, and a person who has a funny way of communicating to other people by just throwing it at them at the last minute, like an open letter.
All right. Are you building up a character study?
No. I'm merely observing. That's all. No, but I mean, do you think that President Trump is mainstreaming white nationalist language then?
Yes, but
homogenizing
but I think he's also opportunistic about it.
Well,
I don't think that he has necessarily changed the political landscape. I think that he recognized things that were already there. You can, and he's clearly opportunistic, because I grew up literally across the water from Mar-a-Lago. So like Trump has always been a part of my life. He was always, when he would get married, we would go down into the yard.
3 or 4 times.
Yeah. It happened multiple times, and there were always very good fireworks, and he was always in the news, and he was usually...
From what I understand, the marriage was like the wedding. There was always good fireworks. So that's really good.
Trump was always in my life, but he was always in my life as somebody who was condemning what we believed. Like he would be in the news saying that David Duke is terrible, or that Pat Buchanan is a racist, or like there's this. I think he was going to run for the Reform Party presidential, and he did it because he thought Pat Buchanan was too racist and he didn't want to be associated with that same party. So I think he's clearly very optimistic. I think he has a lot of the Fox News-ish kind of political beliefs, but he has adopted a lot of the stuff that David was saying in the early 90s, or that Pat Buchanan was saying throughout that time, even though he used to talk about how terrible and racist it was. So I don't see him as changing something. He's just noticing an effective political strategy that hopefully comes back to bite him.
Rising out of hatred. What made you sit for Eli's book? I mean, I'm saying this and giving you credit, because you could have said, I'm changing, etc., and just gone on with your life. Yeah. What made you want to kind of expose that conversion and the abandonment of white nationalism for more, how do you describe your position today, more integrative, more accepting, more...
Yeah, I mean, I'm always trying to figure out what is good service, what is a role I can do, because in some ways it feels a little selfish. I'm a grad student. I spend most of my time hanging around in Hyde Park at the University of Chicago, and there's a lot of stuff I could be involved in, and I end up saying no to most stuff, but I feel like kind of an obligation to push back. There's these moments back then before I even renounced it, where I was talking to Allison, who had these major conversations with me, that I did a lot to push white nationalism, and you can't just stop then. You have to actually push back, even to the extent of just trying to balance the scales. But I think kind of everybody has an obligation to use whatever resources and platform you have. And so if there are people who are recognizing the issues with racist ideas in America, and they feel that me participating in that helps what they're doing, then it's sort of an obligation to do that.
But so you wanted that
Yeah, I think the book does that. Like you know, I don't know if it's recently come out, so I don't think many people have seen it, but it is ostensibly about my crazy, salacious story. But he interviewed everybody at New College, or like 65 people at New College. There's like 7 or 8 stories in there. There's people who are the victims of white nationalism. There are people at the school whose education was disrupted by my being there. There's the people who shut down the school to oppose racism, shut down classes, and got the administration to cancel all activities for the day. Like, all that stuff's there. And I think those are stories that are read because there's a book about my opposition to white nationalism. Like, that feels like a good role to play.
I mean, you call David Duke David.
Yeah.
Are you still in touch with any of the people that are kind of leaders or espousing white nationalism?
Just with my parents, mostly because there's not a lot to talk about. If you're not involved in it, then there's not a lot you have in common. You know, if you don't believe this and you're not pushing forward on it, there's not much to sit around and discuss. It's not kind of close friendships in the same way that some other communities might have. It's really about, we believe this and that's what's in common. And that was true of my family. There was this moment where, like, maybe we're not a family anymore if you don't believe white nationalism. Like, that was a serious possibility.
Derek's your middle name.
Yeah.
Roland is your given name, right?
Yeah.
I mean, both are given, but
yeah.
You wanted to talk about how that came about.
It's interesting because, like, I know people in Chicago. I hang out with people in Chicago, and because when I left white nationalism, I adopted my middle name. I was born Derek Roland, and then I, like, legally changed it because I thought I could not disappear, but get a little bit of Google filter,
right,
and you know, live my life until people found out more about it and say that I've renounced this. And I thought I would never talk about it again, and that white nationalism would die away, and that I would exist as Roland Derek Black forever. And I don't know, America became more in my face, and I felt like I had to speak up about it. And my friends call me Roland. My Allison, who is my significant other, calls me Derek. And it's weird and complicated these days, but, you know.
Okay, so you said this. Allison is your significant other.
Yeah.
I bet you when she confronted you, was kind of yelling at you.
There was some yelling. Yeah. There was some yelling. There was some.
I don't know Allison, but I feel like I know Allison already.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there were times where it's like, let me carefully guide you, and there were times where you are being a moron. You know, you need to back down, and both of those work.
I don't know if I would say to my mother, I'm bringing over an anti-Semite for Shabbat dinner. She would think that was a great idea for the family to have. I give Matthew a lot of credit to saying.
Yeah, he got a lot of pushback when he first started doing that. People stopped coming to the Shabbats. His family questioned whether that was a wise choice. Allison's family strongly questioned whether this was a wise choice, and she didn't come for a long time. She stopped coming to those dinners. And
she's not Jewish?
No, she would. She is white and Christian, and I think that probably had a lot to do with the fact that we could have those tense conversations because she was not implicated.
Do you think you were seeking this change in the sense that you talk about this dinner, but you go? I mean, if I was a white nationalist, and I'm not. I don't know if I would go, the first place I would want to go to school is a small liberal arts school. Like, do you think you were secretly trying to get found?
No, I think it's the opposite. I think I was so confident that there was nobody who could ever change my mind, that there was no danger to it. And on that, it's just sort of mundane. Florida has low in-state college tuition, and New College of Florida is the honors college of the public system. So it was clearly the school that I wanted to go to because they had a medieval history program, and nobody was going to change my mind about anything. And I went to Matthew's dinners assuming nobody was going to change my mind just because I was objectively right. It wasn't something that you could possibly disprove. That was my thinking on that, which is quite arrogant, but I guess in some ways gave me the ability to have those conversations because I was so confident that I was right that I wasn't uncertain about it, and I wanted it to be factually true. A lot of the early stuff was disproving that IQ studies, vary by race. Like, you're misusing statistics if you start talking about IQ differences between races. And if that's not a valid piece of evidence, then I didn't want to use it, but it didn't break down everything.
And you think the biggest way to change this or expose white nationalists is not on the racial argument, but on the anti-Semitic argument?
It depends on the person. I think actually the answer is if you're changing people's minds, it's individual. And it's not necessarily so much fun, but whether you're talking about white nationalism or something else, you kind of have to start with what do you believe and actually understand it. And I don't want that to sound like I'm saying you should invite Nazis to dinner, because I don't think that's actually so productive. I think the most productive thing is to assert that, we hate white supremacy. We want to change it as a community, and that's what you can do most of the time. But if you happen to know somebody in your family, your friend who has some maybe racist idea, then the way you engage with that is asking, could you explain why you feel that way? Do you think there's evidence for that? Why, where are you coming there? And being able to explain to them the same way that they feel that they believe, like that's actually how you engage with people.
Were you surprised the way President Trump responded to Charlottesville?
Oh, absolutely. I still think that was the high watermark for the white nationalist movement. It's so easy to condemn them. That's in the same way that he used to condemn white nationalism in the news for the last 20 years. Anybody could condemn white nationalism. There'd be a rally, and the garbage commissioner would condemn the white nationalist rally. It was so easy. Everybody would do it, which that's the context that they were watching him give this White House press conference and say, some of those people were very fine.
And they thought they won.
Yeah, no, the way they 100% viewed that as he can't come out and say, okay, I support their movement, but this is as close as anyone is ever going to get. And that's their experience of this. So it's just outrageous. Like, there's these moments where it feels like he's supporting them or something, it's
for a reason. That's why. So I'm going to do this rapid round on Chicago.
Right.
All right, this is real easy. Cubs or Sox?
Sox.
Let's do this again. No, okay. Thick or thin pizza?
Thin pizza most of the time, thick once or twice a year.
Okay. Sears or Hancock Building?
Sears.
16-inch or 12-inch softball? Have you ever played 16-inch?
No.
Then you only got one answer.
Okay.
Okay. Lake or river?
Oh, I like to swim in the lake, but the river walk is great. Different things.
You can say that all day long on this podcast. Hey, this is Mayor Emanuel, Chicago Stories with Derek Black, Roland Derek, however you want to go with it. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here.
You've been listening to Chicago Stories with Mayor Emanuel. You can subscribe and leave a review on Apple Podcasts, and tweet your guest ideas using #ShyStories. Thanks for listening.